Hello, everyone. Welcome to an exciting seminar today in our IRES series. We are all gathered on the unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people, which is our reminder that the land that we are working on has a long history and holds a lot of memories. Related to that, I was reading this morning on work that the Musqueam community has been doing for many years now in partnership with UBC on using ground-penetrating radar to in the search for ancestors, and in particular in the search for mass graves at residential school sites. And there's a lot of interesting elements in that work, both, for example, the technology, which is non-destructive and non-intrusive, on all of the cultural and community expertise that goes into that work, which is very sensitive and treated appropriately so. And in the partnership between the Musqueam community and UBC, which seems in that particular case, at least from what I can see, to be a successful one. So a positive example of how this kind of partnership can be carried out. Incidentally, I'm reading these days a fiction book that's based on some of the mine clearing work that went on in Europe after the Second World War, and in particular in beaches in the south of France, which reminded me, so as today I walk these beaches often. It's very easy for me to not think about actively about all of this hard work that had to be carried out. And the parallel that came to my head was how easy it is for me to also work this particular land and not think about all of these invisible mines that this work is working on and covering. And so I wanted to just share an appreciation for the work that is being carried out, and an appreciation for the people who also write about it and help make it a little bit more visible. And we'll now pass it on to Naveen, I believe, for an introduction of our speaker today.
It's really delightful for me to be able to introduce Simon Donner. He's smiling, laughing. As you all know, Simon is a professor in geography and IRES. He's broadly a climate scientist, as well as for the last several decades, he's also been studying coral reef research. But you can all go read a CV. The reason I'm introducing Simon is because I've known him for 25 years. We did our PhDs together. We had the same PhD supervisor. And then we followed kind of different institutional paths and somehow ended up in the same place. So, so you can all go read a CV, but you know, I'm going to tell you some things that are not on a CV. First is that there was actually a point of time when Simon was considering not becoming a scientist. He was actually considering doing a degree in journalism. When he came to do his PhD, he was like trying to decide between doing a science degree and a journalism degree. But then he decided that he would rather be a scientist who writes rather than a journalist who knows a little bit of science. And as those of you who know Simon and his amazing science communication skills, you know, I think he made the right choice. Second thing to know about Simon is that there's a reason he studies coral reefs. I think he's actually a sea creature that walks on land. Those of you who know him, you know, he loves being in the water. And so when he started his PhD, he negotiated with his supervisor, our supervisor, that when the wind speeds are just right, not to expect to see him in the office because he wanted to go windsurfing. So it was actually quite rare to see Simon in the office in perfect conditions. But then he worked like, you know, night times. We're not quite sure when he worked. So the third thing I would say about that is that I also recall an argument with Simon about how he thought that sleeping was overrated. He couldn't believe how humans spend a third of our lives sleeping. We just waste our time sleeping. And so with that, like now he's IRES graduate advisor. So I'm sure he has loads of good advice for you. I have lots more stories another time.
And our PhD advisor was John Foley, who presented here last year. And he used to say that I was a black box. He doesn't know how I did my degree. Let me just clip this on. So I've had, I wanted to talk to everyone here today because I've had a kind of unique and kind of weird opportunity over the past few years to be on this federal advisory body about climate change, but it's really about climate change and energy. And so I thought it would be great to just talk a little bit about what we do, what I've been doing as a part of them, and give you sort of my perspective on how these things work a little bit. And then just to answer questions and just sort of, because I'm curious what people want to know about what it's like to be in that position. So, but before we get there, I'll just do a little bit of a background. This is text from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the original document from Article 2, and this is like sort of the key statement from a climate science perspective. It was saying that whatever comes out of the UNFCCC and all of the negotiations that go forward, whether it's the Kyoto Protocol, Paris, et cetera, that the ultimate objective of all of this was to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that will prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference. In other words, don't allow too much climate change to happen. We want to stop it before it gets dangerous, right? And this is effectively what motivated all the work I've done since I was a PhD student. It wasn't what my PhD was about, but it sort of motivated everything since then. And I think what's key to this is that the word dangerous is subjective, right? And so to some people, that's not me, but this is not, might be something I would have done when I was younger. Maybe it looks a little too steep for me. But to some people, this isn't dangerous, right? But to others, it is. Right. And so dangerous is a subjective concept. And that is the reason that we have two numbers in the Paris Agreement, that we could avoid 1.5 degrees of warming or 2 degrees of warming. Basically, the world didn't agree on the definition of what. And so for me personally, that's what sort of motivated a lot of the research I did over the years. And that's how I ended up doing ocean warming research and coral reef research. It is true I like being in the water. That does help. But you know, the threat to the world's coral reefs seems so dire that if we could figure out at what level of warming, you know, the threat to coral reefs became dangerous, then that's like a level of warming you want, right? And that's actually part of the argument that the small island states used for the 1.5 degree threshold, right? Was this. So that was the science I was sort of doing. I had the advantage the opportunity when I was a postdoc to work in effectively a public policy school. It was a school of public and international affairs, but it was a group of scientists mostly. There's one research group. And so it gave me some window into the policy world, but I didn't work on it. I just got to go to talks, basically. Like I wasn't involved. But over the years, my career sort of went from doing the science to trying to figure out like what we do with the science. And so, you know, I've been doing research in the Pacific Islands for a number of years. So we did a bunch of adaptation in what we call like climate service projects. That's my old and dearly departed friend Tuake at a presentation there with me. I do a lot of engagement, as Naveen's mentioned, and then I always was into the idea of giving policy advice, but I was somebody that just lobbed it. Like I wasn't asked, nobody was asking me, right? So. But I come from a family that gives advice without it being requested, so it's very natural for me. So in the Paris, you know, so Paris comes out in 2015, and you know, it's got the famous line of, you know, we want to hold the temperature increase to well below 2 degrees, and we want to try to pursue efforts to limit it below 1.5. That's what the small island states argued for. And out of Paris. Okay, one of the things in the Paris Climate Agreement was a request to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to do a special report. So not one of the normal assessment reports, but a special report on 1.5 degrees as the threshold, what it would mean, how it would be different than truth. And when that report came out, it kind of motivated a whole bunch of other things. And I think people don't realize that it comes from this report. So when the report came out, we advanced ahead a bit too much, but okay. That's a special report on global warming of 1.5 C. And it famously had this line that if we want to avoid 1.5 degrees of warming, we need CO2 emissions to decline 45% below 2010 levels by the year 2030. That is where the protests began, right? This is where Greta Thunberg's work began, and this is where we have 12 years left to act, or 10 years left to act. It's all based on the year 2030 being the target. Very arbitrary, because of course this was just one number pulled out of a graph. They could have said 47% by 2031, but we like round numbers, right? But the end of that sentence was also really important. It said that this isn't enough. We actually have to reach net zero by the year 2050, right? This had a huge influence on governments around the world. It had a huge influence on companies around the world because it told everybody what the long-term target should be, right? And people started actually adopting a long-term target. And this was important because we went from having these interim emissions reductions targets. We're saying we have to, sort of get to first or second base, to the other one saying that what we have to do to get all the way to home, right? And so it had a really significant impact around the world. And countries all over the world set net zero emissions targets. Now, they weren't all set for the year 2050, but most of them were. And it's easy for a government to say we're going to do something in the next 30 years, but it's better than not having the target, right? And so this was a huge change around the world. And Canada did the same thing. So Canada in 2021, it was tabled in 2019 initially, but it finally became law in 2021. These processes are slow. Canada passed a law saying the same thing. We're going to go to net zero by the year 2050, and we are going to have interim targets along the way. So law passed in 2021. They're going to have there was already a target for 2030, but they're going to have an interim one for 2026. And we do have one. No one ever talks about it. And then they're going to set interim targets along the way. And then net zero will be the goal in the year 2050. But also you'll notice it says we have to publish progress reports. We have to publish a plan. And this is all in legislation. And so the government has to do all of these things as long as the legislation is in place and they're respecting it. And so the government had to put together an emissions reduction plan for the year 2030, et cetera. So this was all put into place in the document. And in there, if you read through the act, there was also this statement saying that they want to establish an advisory body, which would be called the Net Zero Advisory Body, that would provide advice to the minister on how do we get to net zero emissions, including the reduction plans and including the targets, so that the advisory body, external people that are giving the government advice on this. And this idea was not Canada's. The Canadian government had been lobbied to do this very heavily by folks in the country, a little bit outside as well, because this is what other countries have been doing. The UK's Climate Council has been around since 2000, most influential and effective of these climate advisory bodies, but there's about 25 of them around the world now. And there is a Council of Councils, International Climate Councils Network. So mostly in Europe, but not only in Europe. South Africa's council is very effective. New Zealand, Australia, Chile, I believe, has one. And there's a few in Central America as well. And so it's again, same idea. These countries have set long-term targets. Let's have a group of advisors that give us external, independent advice on how to get there. Now, they're all different. Some of them are made up. Some of the European ones are entirely academics or entirely scientists. Other ones are like representatives of civil society. Others are like stakeholders. So South Africa's is each person represents like something, like you represent labor, you represent this, whatever. And that's a little bit unique, but if you think about South Africa's history, it makes sense why they would want to do it that way. Right? So anyway, so these are all sort of put together. And yeah, and so I remember when the bill passed, it was 2019, because it was before the pandemic started. And I remember reading in the news, it's like everyone else. It's like, oh, it's interesting, they're going to have an advisory body. And then like 2 months later, I got an email from the Minister of Environment's office, from somebody in the office who I had met once before, saying, Simon, do you have time today? We'd really like to talk. And it was one of those messages where I'm like, uh-oh, what did I do? It really seemed like I was in trouble, that I'd said something in the news and they were mad and everything. And they said they wanted to ask me to be on the advisory body. And I was like, oh my God, I read about that. I was flattered, but I was also curious as to why. And so I said, could you tell me a little bit about why you are asking me in particular? And they said that, well, we were given the advice that we should have, like when they were consulting about it, that we want to have a climate scientist on the committee, and we wanted somebody that we felt that could communicate well with others. And why me? I don't know. I have suspicions as to how they came up with my name. It probably helped that the minister at the time of the environment at the time was Jonathan Wilkinson, who was from North Vancouver, and I had met him at events a bunch of times. That might be why. I honestly don't really know, because there's tons of people across the country they could have called, but for some reason they asked me. I asked them one other question, which was, who are the other people going to be? And I knew they couldn't tell me the actual names, but just the makeup. And they gave me examples of the types of positions that they have in their day jobs. And it made me feel comfortable. Because the one thing I was worried about was this was going to be like a tokenism thing that's like a scientist and then the head of Enbridge, you know, and everything, which, you know, like they have an opinion that should be shared. They're part of the Canadian economy. But like, I didn't want to be that on something like that. But it was like, if this seems real, that we're really going to be useful, sure. And so I got asked. And for context, this is a real challenge for Canada, and more so than a lot of other countries in like our major trading partners. These are emissions relative to 1990 going up through to the year 2021. And you can see where Canada is. This is against other G7 nations, right? So the thing is that most of the global north emissions have been going down since 2005 and many countries before that. So almost all, pretty much everyone in the G7 except Canada, emissions are now lower even than the 1990 baseline by the UN, used by the UN FCCC. Like, this is actually an accomplishment. Like, it's quite something. Canada's the anomaly. Our emissions are 8% about below 2005 levels, and still 14% above 1990 levels. So we are an outlier. We are sort of behind our trading partners, including the US, on this. But there's also really good reasons for it. And I have to tell you, after years of serving on the advisory body, I find myself surprisingly willing to defend some of what the government has and hasn't done. And it's not because they've won me over because I work for them or anything. It's literally when the more you see how hard some of this is to do, you more respect why we are where we are. One of them is that we are a physically huge country, which means transportation emissions are going to be big, right? It also means that we don't have the same, we don't have some of the same advantages that small European countries do. We also are a very large cold country, right? So heating emissions is, you know, that is a significant issue throughout the winter. We also are a resource dependent country, right? And so we have a large fraction of our emissions comes from oil and gas, and they have historically been that way. And that's not the case for most of these, with the exception of the US, most of the other countries in the G7. But then the other one that is probably the most important one of all of these is that Canada is an extremely loose federation, right? And I'm not the lawyer in the room here, but the federal government does not have jurisdiction over all sorts of things that people who argue for federal climate action should think about more. We can't tell Alberta how much oil to produce, right? Which makes it hard to figure out how you're going to reduce emissions from oil and gas. It comes down to efficiency with you know, how it's produced. And so that makes the challenge really complicated in Canada in a way that's really different from a lot of other countries. So I was named to the advisory body. This was the original composition of the advisory body. There are a couple people whose photos aren't on here because they joined and then 3 weeks later realized they couldn't, or a few weeks or months later realized they couldn't participate. Everybody has a day job. So you're being asked to do this sort of as a side from your day job. And so in a couple cases, people just realized they didn't have the time, they couldn't negotiate it, et cetera, and everything. And so it was a pretty, it was a really amazing opportunity and just experience at the beginning, because it was a group of people that I just would never normally interact with, at least during you know, being a university professor. So NP Mary Pierre Persil and Dan Wicklum, who are the co-chairs, were wonderful and have tons of like governance experience and everything. And then going down to folks like, I spent a lot of time talking to John Wright and Gaetan Thomas. Gaetan's still a member of the NZEB. They both run electricity systems, one in Saskatchewan and one in New Brunswick. So it's really interesting to learn, like, that's an experience I don't have. And so when people would say, how come the advisory body is not all scientists? I would be like, scientists. The scientists don't know how to run the energy system for the country. You need folks like John and Gaetan, right? Sarah Oud, who is now the co-chair along with me, is an entrepreneur from Quebec, and she's been, it's been wonderful working with her over the years, et cetera. And so it's really, just to say, like, it's been a really neat experience just to get to work with such a different range. People just come from really different backgrounds, but all care about the subject, right? Which is really interesting. And so what are we supposed to be doing? We are mandated to provide results, advice on the emissions reductions milestones. So these sort of interim targets, plans produced by the government, and then this any matter referred to by the minister, which is a way of saying that we can come up with our own plans for each year, but the minister could also send us a letter saying we'd like you to do this other thing instead. And so how do we do this? So each year there's basically, we choose lines of inquiry. They may be chosen or sort of put upon us by the minister. And then we're basically drawing on existing research and analysis. We can conduct or commission new research. That is not easy to do because it's very hard to contract anything from the federal government. And I'm happy to talk about that during the questions. And we are to engage with people, which means not necessarily just engaging about what we're producing, but listen to what folks have to say. So we have like we'll have a monthly meeting that's 4 or 5 hours over Zoom. We'll do 1 or 2 in person a year. And then we have a whole bunch of other ad hoc meetings, just random different times of the day, often quite early in the morning here. And a lot of it is listening to folks with expertise or interest groups, folks that know something about whatever subject we're working on, and trying to make sure we're hearing different opinions around the world. So it's a lot of sort of sitting and listening in briefings and asking questions. So that part's really fun and interesting. And then there's a lot of work where once we start to narrow down what the advice could be, there's a lot of work on the details of preparing the advice, preparing the reports, et cetera. We're supported by a team of staff because, again, we all have day jobs, right? And so there is what the government calls a secretariat. It's very common with any type of outside advisory body. They provide you a bunch of government staff to support you. Technically, these are people that work for Environment and Climate Change Canada, but are seconded to the advisory body. In reality, they're still in the same office often with the other people at ECCC, and they're in the uncomfortable position of criticizing the work that the other people in the office are doing. Right. So it's not necessarily easy to be on our advisory body, but my sense has been that the policy analysts and stuff that work with us like it because it's a rare chance to work with people outside of government. Right. So it's kind of there's pros and cons. It's awkward, but it's a neat opportunity, I guess, for folks in government. So they do a lot of the support. If you read one of our reports, they do the original drafting of everything based on what we ask for, and then we go through and edit it. So it's very much like being on a board, if anyone's ever been on a board. It's like that. More engaged, I would say, I think, than most board experiences, but it is helpful to remember that you're on a board because they're trying to be respectful. We all have full-time jobs. I could easily spend every week, my whole week, just doing work for NZAB, but we have a good system that controls that, basically. And so in terms of outputs, we're supposed to put out an annual report to the minister every year. And so that's the main output we have. And we also, legally, the minister has to meet with us at least 3 times a year. Some of that is sort of formal, some of it is informal. And it's never been a problem. Like the minister's happy to come and chat with us. And often we'll have a lot more meetings than just with the minister. We'll meet with the deputy ministers. Sometimes there's associate deputy ministers and then other people in the department, or even maybe just somebody from staff from his office. So every once in a while, like somebody will text me, they just want to check something with me or whatever. So that happens a lot. And the interesting thing about this being legislated is that the minister has to respond. So after we put our advice out, and it's officially out, which is this whole complicated government process, they have to respond within 120 days. So they have to say, are we taking your advice, of each item and go through them one by one? This is not a very punitive thing, like where they come back and say, we didn't take this advice, and then we yell at them about it or something. And it was hard to know at the beginning. I was just a member at the beginning. I wasn't chairing this. At the beginning, I was like, maybe we should be pushier. But then I came to appreciate that you're not going to get very far, like politically, if you're just shouting back and forth. And it's better to be understanding about why they are and are not taking different pieces of advice. And they've even, we've had some pretty frank conversations about like why you are not going to do X, and it's sort of helpful to understand the why. So really key thing is that in determining our realistic pathways to net zero, there are like major criteria we're supposed to consider. This is in the terms of reference. I don't think it's an act, but it's in the terms of reference. Economic costs and opportunities. Indigenous reconciliation, inclusivity and well-being, environmental benefits, and technological readiness, which is, again, all the reasons that I came convinced early on that I don't know why I was chosen, but I'm glad that it wasn't 12 scientists, because this is the wrong expertise, right? So, and we argue a lot. Sometimes we're like, there's the thing that climate-wise seems like the right choice, but does it align with all the other criteria, right? And that's what is hard. So what have we done to date? There's a ton of things you don't see, but the things that you would see is we had an initial report that we were required to do within a few months after being created. And then we had the emissions reduction plan input. So the 2030 emissions reduction plan was created and we put input into it. In this case, and this was back when Jonathan Wilkinson was the minister still, he had asked us specifically to work on 3 things: buildings, transportation, and oil and gas. So sectoral approach. We chose to add a 4th line of inquiry on governance, so that was more kind of cross-sectoral. And so we put that input, we worked on that for a year. And then in Canada's 2030 emissions reduction plan, if you go to the appendix, our entire advice is in the appendix, which was kind of exciting that they actually included the advice. Given that they didn't follow all of it, that was kind of cool. But they were willing to include it, right? So after that, we kind of realized that as much as the sectoral stuff was useful, so much of what we needed to be doing was really across sectors, because we're not supposed to be just giving short-term advice, right? This isn't about the incremental actions. This is about how do we make the transformational stuff to get to net zero 25 or 30 years from now. And so we decided, once we had to choose, that we will think of one kind of cross-sectoral ways of thinking about this. So we again focused on governance, but also on the idea of industrial policy and on sort of the energy system writ large, right? Recognizing that, like, I was chairing the building subcommittee, and I remember Sarah was chairing transportation, and the two of them just kept overlapping in advice, thinking about, if you're thinking about electric vehicles, we need to make sure that commercial buildings are going to have chargers in them. And so we just realized we should think of it in systematic way. So we did that for our first annual report. Second annual report we just finished was largely just 2 requests that we had from the minister, and this is Minister Stéphane Gibault, who took over for Wilkinson, where we got a letter from the minister saying we would like advice on how we can close the gap to the 2030 target. We would like advice on what our 2035 emissions target should be. This one was legislated. We had to do that. The first one was just a specific request. We still had all this other work planned, and we had to put it aside because those were enormous undertakings, especially how to close the 2030 gap involved a lot of modeling. We had to contract out, and it's a big piece of work. In addition to these things, we put out these things called What We Heard reports, which is a sort of government thing to do. But basically, it's reflecting back on everything people told us. We may not have, we have all sorts of meetings, and none of it's ever written up in advice. So there's like a summary of it. And this is mostly the staff work on those. But actually they're pretty interesting because there's all sorts of, like, I don't know, I just feel like I've learned all sorts of interesting things, but they just don't come out of our actual reports. And so at least they're somewhat covered here. And the other thing is that we've had to internally commissioned work. Sometimes it's something that the staff wrote. Sometimes we hired out for it. We had a report on intersectionality, one on oil and gas demand scenarios, one on Indigenous engagement, et cetera. They've been done to help us in our work. And so they're not public in the sense that they're not on the website, but they're public in the sense that they were done using public funds. And so if somebody asked, they could be made available. And we're actually just now having the data whether we can make them available. Part of the problem is somebody does, like a consulting firm did the oil demand scenario stuff. It's in English. Well, we can't release that as a government report. It needs to be translated, and translation is slow. The translation, so it really reads as if it was written by a Quebecer, is slow, right? Just to put it in Google Translate's easy, but that's not good enough for the Government of Canada standards, which is good. So I'll just give you a sense of a little bit of our work. One of the most valuable things we did was that initial report a few months in. And this was on, basically, we were supposed to say, like, come up with some just initial observations. So we read a bunch of reports on other countries had done and looked at the modeling on, like, net zero writ large. And we tried to pull out what were some lessons from all of it. And we pulled out, like, kind of 5 values and 5 principles. And what's been handy about this, particularly for those of us that have been on the advisory body the whole time, is that it kind of set at the beginning a bunch of things that we could use whenever we had to make decisions, right? And I'm happy to talk about any of them, but I'll point two that are being really valuable. One of them was to acknowledge that there's more certainty than uncertainty. And what we meant by that is that for most of the big picture kind of technological stuff, we kind of know what a net zero world would look like. Like we know that passenger vehicles are going to be largely electric, right? And, you know, when we know that we'll be relying, that we will need to electrify a lot of things, including heating and cooling, not in every community in Canada, but in most of Canada, et cetera. And so don't let the fact that there's some uncertainty about other things stop you from the things that we're certain about. An example of this would be, in my job on the committee, I've been pushing all along that I think we can be more aggressive in our advice around phasing out fossil fuel heating and cooling. Now, that doesn't mean get rid of gas furnaces. That's crazy for Canada. It's not affordable for all sorts of parts of the country. But there's many parts of the country where it is. And so there's certainty for many places. Let's not let the small bits of uncertainty stop us from pushing ahead on the places where we can. Right? So this is a principle that's been useful. The other one that's been extremely useful was what we call beware of dead ends. And this is really important. This is the difference between net zero as a goal and just having an emissions reduction target for 5 years from now, right? There's also, so like if your emissions reduction target is to reduce things 20% or 40%, right? There's all sorts of things you can do to get you part of the way, but that aren't compatible with the rest of the, you know, with the rest of the path. It's like sliding into first base versus running around the base, right? An example would be like blending ethanol into gasoline for passenger vehicles, right? We've been doing that for years. What did that involve? Setting up a massive infrastructure, right? Not just meaning what crops are being grown, but like having refineries and everything, the blending, et cetera. I mean, gas stations get used to it, making sure the cars can withstand having that fraction of ethanol in the gasoline because of how it's corrosive on engines. Doing all of this, you set all up. It's jobs. It's you know, it's people's jobs. It's a whole industry being set up. But all it could maybe do is at most give you a 10 to 20% reduction in emissions. So it was never a solution long term. But by creating it, it's now you've got this capital lock-in that's hard to get out. Right. And so this, I would say this is, of all of the 10 values and principles, this is probably the one that I end up using the most, or I find we use the most, because this is where being the net zero advisory body rather than just a climate council is valuable. Is we can say, hey, you know what, that is a good technology, that is a good idea, but our job is to say what's going to get us all the way to 2050, and it doesn't get you far. And that's why, like, natural gas as an option in trucks, which has been talked about for years, it just isn't. It could work to help us meet a target, but it's not compatible with net zero by 2050. So it's not something we would suggest. Somebody else might, but not our advisory body. Right? So let's skip over that. And so actually, we don't need to go for this. So we did that. We gave our advice in the emissions reduction plan. We had 40 pieces of advice across 4 lines of inquiry. And again, like I said, it's in the at the end of the emissions reduction plan report that came out in 2022, I think. After that, we moved to the lines of inquiry that, as I mentioned, that were more cross-sectoral. I'll give you an example of a piece of this. We spent a lot of time, and this is less my area of expertise, the least my area of expertise, on industrial policy, and part of this was what was going on in the U.S. at the time. The Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S. was basically like the biggest piece of industrial policy in like world history, or like in American history at least, right? Saying that we are going to invest in certain technologies. In Canada, for all sorts of reasons, it's a harder thing for Canada to do, but we recognize that we need to be thinking about this. And so one of our key pieces, this is one of the battery plants that was in construction. I can't remember which one this is. But this is our key piece of advice, that we need to focus on on limited number of priority sectors. We didn't say 100% these are the 3 or 4 sectors, but we provided examples with a strong wink in the report. And the examples were EVs, hydrogen, and biofuels. Hydrogen, biofuels, thinking about long distance transportation, and value-added forestry, so basically forest products. were the 4 areas that were specialized. Over this time, we were losing members of the advisory body over time. Folks were just too busy. It is a lot of work, right? And so both Dan and MP, our co-chairs, both had to leave because of just family pressures and just like their home organizations being like, hey, like you can't keep spending 3 days a week doing something else. And so we were sort of getting whittled down over time, and the government did appoint new people. And so the current composition of the advisory body is quite different. And it was at that point that we lost both co-chairs that they reached out to Sarah and I asked if we would take over. Why the two of us were asked specifically, I think, to be honest, I think they wanted, well, you need to have an Anglophone and a Francophone for one. Ideally, two people are bilingual rather than me and Sarah, who is. But I think it was also they wanted people that had been around from the beginning, that just sort of knew what does and doesn't work. Because there's all sorts of things that sound like good ideas, but are just really hard to pull off given the structure. And so I think that was a little bit of why we were chosen. And so we have a number of newer members. What's interesting about the change, and this is sort of an important thing to mention, is, I was appointed, right? So I was effectively like a patronage appointment, even though they didn't actually know me. Now you have to apply but when I was appointed, the act hadn't passed. So the government could just choose what it wants. But once something's in legislation, it becomes an official process. So you need to be given what's called a governor and council appointment. You need to be approved by the Privy Council office and then the Governor General's office. And it's this whole security clearance and the whole thing. They look into your family, they look into my wife's family's background, the whole thing. So it's complicated. And so you actually have to apply. And what's interesting about that is you can imagine the type of people that the minister's office might choose are different than the type of the people that would apply. Because folks, like I was mentioning, like my colleague Gaetan runs the Conseil Economique. He's like the Chamber of Commerce for New Brunswick, right? He's not filling out government applications for something, right? And I love Gaetan, like it's not about him, right? But somebody who's more of an analyst would. Right. And so the people who are applying are fantastic, but it's a different group of people than the folks that would be first appointed. And it's just, I plant that as something to think about how to design it, because there's pros and cons to each, right? And so that's what we've been doing. And so what happened was over the past year, we got those requests from the government to do the work on closing the gap to 2030 and carbon budgeting. Thank you. And the 2035 target. And so we wrote 2 reports about those. And our annual report basically became 3 reports because it was such an enormous piece of work. We were like, we cannot release it all at once. It's way too much to have to explain. So we kind of staggered them a little bit and put out the 2 reports. The big thing that was more public about it was our advice on the emissions reduction target for 2035. They did not take our advice. They tried, but they were close. The target we suggested was very aggressive, and the target they chose was a little bit less and everything. But we had a lot of back and forth with the government about it, which was quite good. I won't go into the specifics of the advice. So that's what we spent most of last year doing. And right now, what we're working on are kind of the work that we had wanted to start, but got delayed by all the requests from the minister last year, and then things that came up out of last year's work. So one of them is we're continuing on industrial policy and on the energy systems vision. We have those are 2 items that will come out before the federal election, which we're expecting in a couple months. There may be an election. We are separately and behind the scenes working on sort of addressing sort of the net part of net zero, so the negative emissions part of net zero, and also looking at how the government can work with the provinces and territories, which is complicated on its own. We also have some work on agriculture that's been commissioned, and work on what we can learn from like other federal entities like crown corporations and stuff. These are kind of more smaller projects. I'm not sure what's going to come of them. These will not be finished before an election is called. So it's hard to say how they will proceed because it might not be in our control and everything, but that's sort of where we are now. And I'll just give you a few observations and then we can go to some questions. This has been an incredible opportunity to be a part of. It's been a busy few years, and it's been like basically, it's been very, sort of multiple personalities, feeling like flipping back and forth between meetings about wildly different subjects between the two, my job here and this job. And one of the things that I've learned from this is that we need transformational change, and the problem is that our systems are incremental. And I think we all know this, but I mean the little, like the systems down to like, how do you actually pass something? How many steps do you have to go through to put a piece of legislation together? System thinking is really challenging in large institutions because so much of what happens in government is a legacy of independent decisions, right? And so part of the reason so many processes are slow and the government is so slow to make a decision to put whatever the thing you've heard about, how come it hasn't been passed yet, is because for reasons that are good, equality, anti-corruption, et cetera, we've added so many steps and processes to government work that it is really slow to do anything, right? And so again, none of the individual decisions were necessarily bad, right? We probably agree with all of them, but they don't necessarily work very well together, right? I've been, and I think because of that, I noticed that a lot of the academic solutions and things that I used to think were good ideas that I would suggest from the outside, I realize now I know why they don't work, right? Because I didn't know enough about how government operates. But the middle point there is a really important one. The bureaucracy of government, I mean, you think the bureaucracy of UBC is bad? Oh my God, like the bureaucracy of the federal government is a whole other level of anything. But I'll say the piece that impresses me is the sense of accountability and collective mission of government employees and the folks we work with. Like, I rarely come away from a meeting not impressed by the people I met with. Right, and it's been really great to kind of comforting to know about our government. I think what I've seen a lot is that policymakers are going to listen to the people who will answer their specific questions, and a lot of what we do as academics is answer our questions, right, or the things we're interested in, and that's why that doesn't go anywhere. But what drawback of this is that it means if you're somebody that can produce a number, so you do some sort of technical modeling and you can produce a number, that's what they're going to use. And it means that we way over rely on the technical modeling of policy impacts. A lot of the modeling is not that accurate. The people who do it know that because of the assumptions that have to go in, but it's a number and the minister can repeat it, and that's what's going to be effective. And so for me, it just means that common advice people get for policy work is that you got to be ready for when the question arises, and that most effective policy advocates are people that are ready with the thing for when the window's open. You're ready to go with your suggestion when the window's open. But the really destructive side effect of this is a lot of what happens is stuff gets relabeled to meet shifting priorities. So something that used to be called this is now called this. Right, so we used to be moving, for whatever, and now everything gets called natural climate solutions. Right, I'm not against natural climate solutions, but there's a lot of creative labeling in all sorts of areas of climate work today because it can now fit into a category the government says it has to care about. And so, two more observations. I would just say that it's really taught me to be mindful of the potential public and political legacy of your work. We are more than ever at universities incentivized to get attention for our work and be careful about the impact of it, because a lot of the academic stuff we do that could have policy impact, it's missing a key piece, but somebody might pick it up and use it. And I've seen this happen again and again. And the last piece of advice, the last thing that this is the one I come back to daily pretty much, is that how much advice changes when you have something at stake. It's really easy to look at where Canada is on climate change and just throw rocks and be like, why can't we do this? When you actually are in the position to try to, and I'm not in a position to make any decision, we're just giving advice, right? But you realize how much harder it is to do these things when you have to consider all the other viewpoints or competing issues, right? And I can tell you all sorts of anecdotes about that if you're interested. So there was just some take-home messages. I'm going to skip that part. Didn't need that. And so if folks are interested, this is the NZAB's website. There's also a French version of the website as well. And all of our reports and everything are available there. But otherwise, I'd just love to hear your questions. So thanks.